Welcome, friends, to St Mary's the University Church. My name is Naomi. I'm one of the clergy on the staff here, and it's a real delight to welcome you to the church for this public lecture this evening. Some of you will have been attending the Conference of Political Theologies of a Democratic Common Life at New College, and some of you will be joining us from outside that sphere as part of the public engagement of that conference. It's a real delight to have you wherever you've come from and also wherever you're going on to. Some very brief housekeeping notices. If you need the loo over the course of this evening, they are available. If you head to the back of church and on what is currently my right, you'll see a sign directing you past the glass wall. There are two toilets there, one of which is an accessible loo, and you're very welcome to use them. The lecture this evening is live streamed. And we will have a session of Q&A towards the end. So just bear that in mind over the course of the evening. We will have a roving mic so that all the questions are audible. I think those are all the kind of boring housekeeping things. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but should the fire alarm go off, our stewards will direct you to a place of safety. The session this evening will have three sections. We start with a lecture, followed by a roundtable discussion, and ending with, as I mentioned, a time for Q&A. So this gives us time to absorb, then to digest and discuss what is being presented to us this evening. The title of the lecture is Post-Islamism as a Critique of Muslim Exceptionalism, Democratization in Muslim-Majority Contexts. It's a real delight to welcome Professor Mojtaba Mahdavi, who is Professor of Political Science and the ECMC Chair in Islamic Studies at the University of Alberta. Professor Mahdavi will be speaking to this topic before the round table, and he'll be using post-Islamism, an idea to critique the notion of Muslim exceptionalism, the notion that Islam as an ideology is incompatible with democracy. He'll be able to speak with much greater articulacy on that subject than I. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'd like to extend my gratitude to the conference organizing committee, particularly Professor Marita van der Tull for inviting me, and also to my dear colleagues who will participate in the roundtable after the presentation. And thank you to all of you for being here. And I look forward to have an engaging and critical discussion with you on this very, I guess, controversial topic, perhaps. As you may have noticed, there are two key concepts in my presentation in the context of challenge of democratization in Muslim majority context, Muslim exceptionalism and post-Islamism. So allow me to briefly conceptualize and contextualize these two concepts and explore how they relate to the idea of successful democratic transition in Muslim majority context. First, what is Muslim exceptionalism? The political crisis of contemporary democratic social movements in the post-Arab Spring Middle East and North Africa MENA is a fact. This includes the crisis of Iran's Women's Life Freedom Movement in 2022, as well as its pro-democracy Green Movement in 2009, Turkey's Gezi Park movement in 2013 did not gain much politically, and of course, no successful transition to democracy in the Arab Spring movement. Tunisia, the last hope for the Arab Spring, is now experiencing a democratic backsliding. Secular despot, the Arab right-wing populists in Egypt, Tunisia, and Saudi Arabia are consolidating their power, making their countries great again. Iran's ruling Islamists are in power. Turkey's Erdoganism remains a huge challenge to its democracy. You follow the news. The Taliban is back in Afghanistan. Syria's decade of brutal proxy war under the secular despot Bashar al-Assad is now replaced with so much uncertainty under the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the former Al-Qaeda ISIS leader. Libya, Yemen, and Sudan are war-torn countries, at least two of them thanks to the liberal humanitarian intervention, quote unquote. And we have been witnessing a genocide in a slow motion in Gaza, Palestine, by Israeli authorities over the past few years or so. So what am I talking about? What is hope for this region? And it is exactly because of these political conditions that we have witnessed the rise and revival of old Orientalist discourse of Muslim exceptionalism, which claims that Muslim culture is inherently and essentially is incompatible with democracy and pluralism. Muslims are exceptionally immune to civil rights and gender justice due to the particularity of their culture, civilizations, and religion. Their cultural DNA is simply different. That's the argument. This perspective presents a false dichotomy, in my view. Muslim majority societies, accordingly, are forced to choose between militant Islamist autocrats or modernizing secular despots. There is no third option, according to this discourse of Muslim exceptionalism. I think Orientalism in reverse, in the form of Islamism, and even a particular reading of cultural relativism reinforce this discourse and narrative, tying authoritarianism to Muslim culture and contributing to the crisis of pluralism and secular democracy in Muslim majority contexts. Let me share with you a quotation from late Professor Bernard Lewis, a British historian of the Middle East from Princeton University, whose views of the Arab Spring best represent the fallacy of Orientalist discourse of Muslim exceptionalism. In his remark published in Jerusalem Post in February 25, 2011, Lewis says, "In the Muslim world, casual sex, Western style, doesn't exist. If a young man wants sex, there are only two possibilities: marriage and a brothel. You have these vast numbers of young men growing up without the money, either for the brothel or the bride price, with ranging sexual desires. On the one hand, it can lead to the suicide bomber who is attracted by the virgins of paradise, the only one available to him. On the other hand, sheer frustration." So basically, the idea is that if people come to the streets or do any political activity is out of sexual desire, there's absolutely no other desire, incentive, or any other political, socio-economic context. And he's not alone. There is a variety of this sort of Orientalist discourse with many, many great examples. This discourse has many shortcomings, but it's suffice to say that here that this is a very reductionist, essentialist, deterministic, static, monolithic, and ahistorical argument. Why? Because it ignores the livelihood and dynamics of Muslim majority societies. It underestimates the ongoing and everyday resistance and achievements of ordinary people. It reduces Muslims' multiple and multi-layers of identity, both individual and social identity, to a single abstract concept of religion and Islam, very religious centrism. It undermines significant impacts of socio-economic, state, and political structure of power on such crises, and completely overlooks how the post-colonial conditions and new forms of domination at the global level have massively contributed to the crisis of democratization and consolidation of authoritarianism in Muslim societies. Obviously, I am not denying Muslims' agencies or the significance of internal factors in such crises. My point is to acknowledge the impact of global structure of power in socio-economic conditions of Muslim majority context. This includes war, military intervention, occupation, genocide, brutal economic sanctions, among other forms of neo-colonial policies. But my presentation critiques these essentialist assumptions by exploring post-Islamism as an authentic, homegrown, alternative discourse and practice. Post-Islamism reflects the aspirations of marginalized, subaltern Muslims who seek a democratic polity beyond the failures of autocratic secularism and militant Islamism. It conceptualized a path that reconciles the sacred and the secular, offering a progressive response, at least in some cases, to the myth of Muslim exceptionalism. Now, let me briefly talk about post-Islamism, what exactly I mean by this concept. But before I conceptualize and contextualize post-Islamism, I think it's important to define what Islamism is. And let me briefly define it. The crisis and failure of two autocratic secular discourses of state-sponsored nationalism and modernization, and the third world autocratic socialism in the post-colonial Muslim world contributed to the heydays of Islamist movement in the 1970s, 80s, and mid-90s as a response and reaction to the failure of these autocratic secular policies. The Islamist concept of Islamic State in this context, which is a very modern post-colonial construction, by the way, and a reinvention of tradition, not necessarily representation of tradition, attracted the middle class and the urban poor in Muslim majority states. That was the slogans of Islamists as a solution to the crisis of post-colonial Muslim majority context. By the late 1990s, however, it was clear that Islamists were losing their social base in a number of Muslim majority society. The crisis of Islamists in power in Iran, the Turkish Islamists, and I mean Erbakan's changed political party, not Erdogan, and some Islamists in the Arab world was evident. Additionally, as Asif Bayat argues, Islamist exclusive social order, patriarchal disposition, and broadly intolerant attitudes towards different ideas and lifestyles disappointed their social base, facilitating the rise of something we call post-Islamism. So, contrary to the Orientalist discourse, Islamism is not simply and merely a cultural, traditional phenomenon. It is a post-colonial political invention with definitely certain religiosity and religious discourse. And to use Abdullahi and Naim's words, to establish an Islamic state based on a particular reading of the Sharia. Islamism has been a response and reaction to the failure and crisis of post-colonial order, autocratic modernization, nationalism, and top-down modernization. Although I acknowledge the many faces of Islamism, the plural, the core of Islamist ideology, I argue, is twofold. First, to establish a form of an Islamist state based on their very particular exclusive interpretation of Islam and or Sharia. It could be from above or from below, as an alternative solution to the post-colonial crisis. And the second pillar is to envision Islam as they, I guess, envision as the only and sole defining elements of Muslims at the individual, social, and political levels. Such a Puritanian view ignores the cultural, the plural, and multi-layer Muslims' identities in modern time, which is constructed in negotiation between pre-Islamic heritage, Islamic culture, and modern values, because Muslims are basically living in 21st century, a combination of so many layers of identity, pre-Islamic era, Islamic era, and of course, modern contemporary values, whereas Islamism is quite reductionist discourse in this context. Moreover, Islamist ideology ignores the intersectionality of class, gender, generation, ethnicity, race, non-Islamic culture, and politics in shaping our identities, our beliefs, and behaviors. Our religious beliefs are very much colored by intersectionality of many factors. It is not pure. Hence, to put this in a constructivist and phenomenological term, religion is what religious people make of it. Orientalists, Islamists, and other advocates of Muslim exceptionalism seem to ignore this fact, the complexity of our identity. Now, post-Islamists seem to have distanced themselves, though with different degrees and many limitations, from these twin pillars of Islamist discourse, the idea of an Islamic state and the idea of Islam as the sole defining character of contemporary Muslims. Let me explain. The term post-Islamism was coined by Iranian distinguished sociologist Asif Bayat, who defined it as a social condition and a project. It is a social condition in the Muslim majority context where Islamism is exhausted due to its own internal contradictions as well as societal pressure from Muslim societies. Some of them were actually former advocates of Islamism who now see the failure of Islamists in delivering their promises, creating a new, tragic politics in the post-colonial context. But post-Islamism is also a project. It is a conscious attempt and a dialogical discourse to transcend the post-colonial false dichotomies and constructed binaries, such as faith and freedom, sacred and secular, religion and reason, tradition and modernity, and local and global. Post-Islamists actually challenge these false dichotomies, and they simply suggest that it's quite possible to have both, a synthetic dialogical approach. I should also mention that, obviously, post-Islamism is not post-Islam. It is post-Islamism. It welcomes the public presence of civil religion in civil society or even party politics, but it categorically rejects the concept of a divine or religious Islamic state. Why? Because the state is a secular entity and it cannot be Islamized. Islamic State, as Abdullahi and Naim argues, is a modern post-colonial invention actually invented by Islamists with no record in Islamic tradition. For post-Islamists to use freely and Naim's argument, instead of sharp dichotomies between religion and secularism that relegates Islam to the purely personal and private domain, it basically calls for balancing the two by separating Islam from the state and regulating the role of religion and politics. So it's basically challenging, I guess, a religious state, but it very much welcomes the public role of religion in civil society and even party politics. Contrary to the conventional wisdom, and with a few exceptions, I argue that post-Islamist critical and dialogical discourse widely represents lives of ordinary Muslims in 21st century. It is secular, but not against religion. And it is inspired by religious core values of human dignity, justice, freedom, and these words are basically exact words and concepts we actually heard during the mass demonstration in many Muslim, streets during the Arab Spring, before and after that. Now, let me quickly provide some concrete examples of post-Islamism in contemporary lives of Muslims, some hard facts to showcase that post-Islamism is not just an abstract idea, an ivory tower utopian concept constructed by some academics. It is not. There are 5 major units or level of analysis I can briefly mention here with respect to the reality of post-Islamism. And here are, in brief, order. The very first example of post-Islamism at the level or unit of party politics are the following examples. The classic example of a post-Islamist political party was and still is the Renaissance Party, or Hizb al-Nahda in Tunisia, under, Rashid al-Qanoushi's leadership. It's a classic case of post-Islamist party. Egypt's center party, Hizb al-Wasat, or the Kefaya movement before the Arab Spring. Justice and Development Party, both in Morocco and Turkey. Yes, I know things are not in a good shape in Turkey. I have things to share with you. But at least on the paper and for the first few years, Justice and Development parties discursively actually represented post-Islamism. Pakistan's Tehrir wa Insaf political party, Imran Khan's. Iran's reformist political parties under President Khatami and a few other cases. Indonesian political parties associated with the idea of civil Islam movement and many other cases. The second level or unit of analysis to understand examples of post-Islamism is an intellectual level. And here I define post-Islamism broadly, and not necessarily as a former Islamist who actually become post-Islamist. No. Here I define it, any Muslim intellectuals who has radical critique of Islamism could be, considered in this concept in a very free and broad definition of post-Islamism. And many of these Muslim critical thinkers, reformists, with different, views. Some of them are conservative, some liberal, some more progressive, some post-structuralist, and there are many great examples here. I'll be more than happy to share with you some names, but just to mention a few names here: Rashid al-Khanouchi of Tunisia, Iran's reformist, Abdul Karim Soroush, Shabistari, Kadivar, or even Ali Shariati of Iran before the revolution, and many other cases, men and women across the Muslim intellectuals who are radically criticizing Islamism from within. The third example and level of analysis to provide some examples of post-Islamism is at the state level. And this is where post-Islamists have not been very successful, I should say. There are not many great cases here, but again, let me mention just a few cases with some caveats. Tunisia's An-Nahda, or Renaissance Party, was a very strong and relatively successful post-Islamist state until Kais Said's coup in 2021, unfortunately. Turkey's Justice and Development Party was a relatively good example of post-Islamism, at least for the first few years in Turkey, but definitely for the first few years, and maybe if you are generous, we could say for the first decade. Things, of course, got worse after that. I'll talk about this briefly. The fourth example and level of analysis for post-Islamism is at the societal level. Many societies across the Muslim world, from Tunisia to Indonesia. And this is perhaps the strongest presence of post-Islamism. And I think this is what matters most. With different degrees of transitions and different scopes and different socio-historical contexts, cultural context, particularity, we could say a great number of Muslim majority societies have already passed the era of Islamism as a hegemonic and popular discourse, as an alternative to the crisis of post-colonial condition, and they are already actually in the state of post-Islamism. You might say, how do we explain the rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, such this or that sort of radical Islamist discourse? I have things to share with you later on, but I guess let me finish this first. My argument here is that each society, of course, is different. Afghanistan is not Iran. Lebanon is different from Egypt. Indonesia is different from, let's say, Pakistan. And each Muslim country has its own peculiarity. Nonetheless, in overwhelming majority, if not all the cases actually, if not, we can actually see a transition from Islamism to post-Islamism. And if we have a free, fair, competitive election, I argue that in majority of cases, Islamist political parties will not win the election. It's not that people do not want to see public religion. No, as I mentioned, actually post-Islamists appreciate public religion. It's the whole idea of Islamism and with its twin pillars of Islamist discourse. There has been gradual but constant structural, demographic, discursive, and normative transition, shifts, paradigm shifts across the Muslim world, Muslim majority societies, from Islamism to post-Islamism as a social condition, but certainly not as a political reality or political condition or a state. So I'm here basically talking about societal level. The fifth and final level of analysis to understand some examples of post-Islamism, I just want to provide you some examples of contemporary social movement across the Muslim societies. I invite you to rethink many contemporary Middle Eastern social movements, where in some cases millions of people actually chanted post-Islamist slogans such as freedom, justice, human dignity. 2009's Iran Green Movement, the first post-Islamist mass social movement in the region. The first wave of the Arab Spring, 2010-2011, followed by the second wave, 2019, same. 2013 Gezi Park movement, and the recent demonstration in Turkey over the past few days. These are, of course, great examples of post-Islamist movement and post-Islamist condition against Erdoganism and other, I guess, authoritative policies. Even Afghanistan's women's resistance, as well as Massoud's resistance to the Taliban, is great, another actually example of post-Islamism in such a conservative country. Then definitely we can talk about women's life freedom movement in Iran in 2022, which I would like actually to share with you a brief, I guess, remarks from American philosopher Michael Hart, who suggests that, who actually praised this movement as something really, really interesting, and let me actually read his remarks here. He says that the women life freedom movement, Zan Zendegi Azadi in Iran, with its fascinating slogans of women life freedom, could be supplement and or reinterpretation of the French Revolution slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity. Why? Because the word fraternity implicitly reveals the patriarchal power, whereas the meaning of freedom and liberty in today's Iran is what French in their revolution could not have imagined. This is the inclusion of women in the slogan, or a novel equation of women plus life equal freedom. So the conventional wisdom of Orientalists and Orientalism reverse suggests that this region is so much of patriarchal, patrimonial things, gender justice doesn't really exist, which doesn't exist, of course, nowhere, more or less. But this generalization, of course, is quite problematic because we see actually quite a remarkable women-friendly movement in the heart of the Middle East. Now, I believe these are some strong cases, of course, to demystify the myth of Muslim exceptionalism. The post-Islamist condition has a great potential to materialize an emancipatory, homegrown, bottom-up third path that is distinct from despotic secularism and autocratic Islamism. A third path which neither appreciates a Western-centric, hegemonic, top-down universalism or an essentialist particularism of Islamism. It calls for a universalism from below, a path to materialize a modernity and democracy which is both global and local. It's a local achievement. However, there are several obstacles ahead of post-Islamist movement to materialize its grassroots democracy, and allow me to briefly mention 4 challenges. I do not intend to give you a very rosy picture of post-Islamism. We do not want to romanticize this phenomenon. There are limits and shortcomings, but definitely one step forward. That's number 1 point. The second point is that, like Islamism, there are post-Islamisms, plural. Some more conservative than others, some more liberal, some even more progressive with some socialist perspective and post-structuralist discourse. Some cultural, there are, of course, social-cultural conservatism, new liberal economic policies, and authoritarian political trends among some of these, which are great challenges to the success of democracy in Muslim majority states. But now let me summarize very briefly, 4 major challenges to the success of post-Islamism. The very first one comes a challenge from within, and that's authoritarianism. Authoritarian politics, the classic case today perhaps is Erdoganism in Turkey, which is a classic case of effectively undermining the political success of post-Islamism. His domestic policy of suppressing social movement and a regional policy of neo-Ottomanism basically de-post-Islamized the state policies. Now, I think the Gezi Park movement is a much better and greater example and manifestation of post-Islamist condition in Turkey. The second challenge is reimagining and reintroducing autocratic secularism as a solution to save the country from the danger of Islamism. I think this is a wrong approach to follow. And this is exactly what happened in Egypt after overthrow of President Morsi and the rise of Sisi, or things happen in Tunisia in 2011 with the rise of secular despot to challenge the politics. So the return of military rule in Egypt and autocratic secularism in Tunisia are definitely examples of this backsliding, which is not good for the success of post-Islamism in the region. The third challenge includes war, as I briefly mentioned, military intervention, even in the name of humanitarian, assistance, occupation, global war on terror, which has been actually global war of terror, genocide, economic sanctions against ordinary people. All of these actually have drastic negative impact on civil society, on the life of ordinary people, middle class, urban poor, lower class, because if you want to have a successful, form of democracy from within, these people actually need to be strong. And everything like this is going actually to destroy the success of democracy from within, a post-Islamist democracy from within. These are definitely greater challenges. Also, all of this actually will energize militant forces, radical forces, and definitely in the form of Islamist or nationalist populist discourse. The fourth challenge for the success of post-Islamism in Muslim majority context, I think, is the ignoring the discourse of social justice, unfortunately. Some of the post-Islamists simply talk about human rights, civil rights, these are great things, but at the expense of ignoring the life of ordinary people, social justice. And the gap between poor and rich definitely is the best scenario and a situation for the rise of right-wing populism, as you can see everywhere, even in modern democracies. Neoliberal policies are not helpful for a successful rise and success of post-Islamist democracy in Muslim majority context. Finally, a few quick points as my concluding remarks are the following. While post-Islamism as a social condition is prevalent and dominant somehow in many Muslim majority societies, Islamism still is alive. And also, of course, we need to understand several domestic and global obstacles hinder the development of homegrown post-Islamist democracy. And I briefly mentioned these challenges are primarily political, economic, institutional, and of course, certain particular interpretation of religion in a specific context. However, the point is Muslims are not culturally immune to pluralism and democracy, as I tried to mention and provide some facts in this short presentation. The second point is that post-Islamism manifests in multiple forms. At its core, it rejects two fundamental aspects of Islamist discourse, the notion of an Islamic state and also the idea of Islam defined by Islamists as the sole or primary, features of Muslim identity. And again, I repeat myself, this doesn't mean that you cannot be influenced or got influenced by your religiosity in politics, but basically public religion is fine, but it's challenging the whole idea of Islamic state as they define it. And the last point is, there are many forms of post-Islamism, many different interpretations of post-Islamism, but in my view, perhaps the best one, the one actually has more chances to provide a sustainable form of democracy, something from within, is a more progressive, egalitarian version of it, which have potential to challenge both religious fundamentalism and market fundamentalism, Western-centric universalism, and Islamist particularism. So this particular version perhaps can offer a promising alternative for fostering a pluralistic and justice-oriented society grounded in indigenous values of Islam and non-Islamic culture, but at the same time, influenced by certain global values. In the era where we are actually living in a post-Islamist and post-secular condition, where both religion and secularism, sacred and secular, are more humble, to listen to each other and actually promote more, dialogue and constructive conversation. Thank you very much.
Great. Good evening, everybody. I think my sound is all okay, I suppose. Everybody at the back hearing me? Is that okay? Better? Okay. Wow. Okay. Lovely. Great. Okay. I am delighted, to welcome you to our panel discussion. My name is Hossein Dabag. I'm a philosopher by training, and my job here just to challenge our panelists. That's what I'm going to do. And I have the privilege just to chair the discussion. We're gonna talk about the role of religion and how religion possibly shapes the kind of democratic arrangement or possibly democratic structures that we have in different contexts. And we are fortunate that we have got different panelists from different walks of life. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to start with a question for all the panelists, and then I'm going to question them individually, and then I'm going to open up the floor for the audience. Okay. Professor Mujtaba Mahdavi, he's a professor of political science at University of Alberta. Ramazan Klinch, professor of political science and director of the School of Government and International Affairs at Kennesaw State University. And Sophia Johnson, postdoctoral researcher in the political reception of the Hebrew Bible, Faculty of Protestant, Royal University of Bochum, and co-chair of the Protestant Political Thought Network. So I'm going to start with a kind of general question for all panelists, if that's okay. So let's explore the tension between religion and democracy. It's the main discussion. Let's unpack that idea. And the question is, do you think that tension possibly is a universal tension within different kind of traditions, Islam tradition or otherwise possibly, or just particularly that's a kind of tension for a specific tradition? I hope the question is clear. Okay, do you have the mic over there? That's okay. Please, Sophia, are you going to start with that?
Okay, the question is there a tension between religion and democracy worldwide? Basically, the question is religion, Islam, Christianity, Judaism compatible with democracy, right? I like the quote from my colleague Asif Bayat in one of his writing, and he says, with all due respect, this is a wrong question. And the right question is that under what conditions religious people can make these things compatible? Because religion is not something actually abstract out there. We really need to give agencies to people, to religious people. I can provide you many different examples of how religious people have been super democrats, pro-social justice, from liberation theology in Christianity, Catholicism, even the, I guess, contemporary Pope, some of his progressive values, Judaism everywhere, Buddhism, and and Islam's definitely, and I can give you some examples of how in every single religion, religious people have been horrible in terms of authoritarianism, totalitarianism. So in a way, I avoid essentializing religion, and I avoid essentializing democracy at the same time. I give more agency to people on how they read their religiosity in a specific context. And as I briefly mentioned, all religiosity is not pure. It's very much colored by our class, gender, ethnicity, interpretation, the kind of life we have. So in this context, yes, it is possible to make this happen, and it is possible actually to make sure this will not happen. It really depends on the agency of people. That's my 2 cents.
If I can piggyback off of that, I think for a long time there was this narrative in Western intellectual discourse, Western scholarship, that Christianity had to be the bearer of democracy because they were the ones who had carried it from ancient Rome into the modern world and these sorts of things. And of course, we know that that's a narrative that has been spoken into existence by the West, and therefore a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that they have exclusive domain over democracy, Christianity writ large. But as you said, there are so many examples to the opposite within the Christian tradition. But also in the sort of other direction, if we take democracy in a less technical sense, and thinking more along the lines that you mentioned of egalitarianism and attention to the populace and social justice and a lot of these values, we have examples of it historically from all different cultures globally, even before the term democracy is coined in Greco-Roman culture. So I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy to speak so in such binary terms.
I think I will second my colleagues here. I think agency, the context conditions are the right question to ask in terms of the engagement between religion and democracy or religion and political processes. It is universal, but different permutations of it can be really contextual. So the question then is really, the compatibility requires a little bit nuanced explanation. I'm glad that Sophia made references to the Christian history, and even today, Christian nationalism, for example, you can ask the question if it is compatible with democracy. For the Muslim world, you can ask, there are lots of illiberal Muslim practices that are very incompatible with democracy, but at the same time, there is lots of within Islam approach to democracy. I think one thing that I want to emphasize at least, or add to the debate, is why do we see the failures of Islamism or Muslims in general? Of course, it's not about Muslim exceptionalism, but there are some exceptional conditions and processes that we can probably, we should address. Because I thank you so much, Dr. Mahdevi, for the presentation. I really liked the way that you said, but something really struck me. It is, when it comes to the state level, we keep seeing failures. I mean, Islamism, like in Tunisia, in Turkey, when they come to power, it didn't sustain. So there is something that we need to address. Of course, in Tunisia, it's not mostly Islamist, but mostly the secularist part. But in Turkey, it is their failure. I think one thing that has been exceptional condition, not essentially, has been like one is Western colonialism, the other is secular authoritarian legacies in the Muslim world. I mean, Islamism is indeed very new, as you mentioned in your talk. It was a reaction to Western colonialism recently. But at the same time, it was also another reaction to secular authoritarianism after the post-colonial period. So Islamism, in a way, is a kind of backlash against that. So it had difficulty to redefine itself. Going beyond the reaction and to assert itself. I think we will have a discussion on that. Maybe recently we have some chance to that. But I think that is some sort of an exceptional condition that we have observed in the Muslim world.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to start with a particular question, Professor Mahdavi, about what you mentioned about the idea of post-Islamism. And one of the main challenges that possibly we have in the literature, I mean philosophical literature, or possibly empirically kind of supported kind of literature, that in Muslim majority contexts, this post-Islamist kind of framework, some people might argue that is a reinforcement of sort of colonialism again? Is an imperialist kind of framework kind of dressed up in a kind of nice language? When we talk about democracy, when we talk about secularism, when we talk about human rights, one of the main challenge is this post-Islamism as a kind of political reality is kind of reinforcement of that colonialism. And that's why there is a kind of backlash against post-Islamism. How would you respond to that challenge? Theoretically and practically, I mean, either way, how would you respond to that challenge?
Thank you. If I understood your question correctly, you say that there is a backlash towards idea of democracy, human rights, post-Islamism in Muslim majority context because people think that these are Western colonial concept, right? Well, I disagree because when people actually in millions came to the streets of Cairo, Tunis, Tehran, I mean Aden, I mean just name it, and chanted, we want freedom, we want social justice, we want human dignity, and there was absolutely no single reference to the idea of Islamic Caliphate during the Arab Spring, or before that, Iran's Green Movement, or after that, other social movement in Gezi Park or others. I think the idea of democracy, civil rights are accepted across the ordinary Muslims. And I know that there are issues with respect to the question of gender justice and the question of sexuality, women's issue, which is not exceptional to the case of Muslim majority states everywhere. You can actually see even in post-industrial societies. And even if you look at some of the centrist surveys done by institutes such as Gallup and others, these are strongly support that the overwhelming majority of Muslim public sphere actually support democracy, freedom. And yes, we could actually discuss what democracy means exactly, and I posed the same question to everyone, those of us especially doing political theory and theories of democracy. There are different theories about democracy, and I mean, we have actually a democratic backsliding now in post-industrial societies. I mean, the whole idea of democracy is in crisis, definitely. But when it comes to the common sense of Muslim public sphere, I think they very much appreciate that, and there are many evidence. But you might actually challenge me, then why all of a sudden we see so many backlash and failure and crises? And here, I want to actually avoid theorizing in a very big narrative, meta-narrative thing. I would say we should discuss each case individually. And here we definitely need to talk about internal factors such as, the rentier state, economic class, state authoritarianism, historical context, definitely the lack of a strong institution, lack of inclusive discourse, lack of charismatic, strong leadership to have a successful transition, definitely external factors such as war, economic sanctions, genocide, a combination of factors. I've actually written a piece about the challenge of democracy across the Muslim world, and I try to divide these obstacles and factors into two different categories of structural factors versus non-structural factors. Structural factors are divided into a structure of the state, what kind of a state apparatus they have, then socio-economic structure of society, to what extent equality exists or not, or a huge gap between poor and rich, and the global structure, to what extent global structure is helpful. When you have actually repeated attack and, genocide and, colonialism, intervention, military coup, well, what do you expect comes out of this? ISIS comes out of war crimes in Iraq, right? And Syria, and proxy war in Syria. It would be very naive to blame ordinary Muslim or a tradition for the rise of ISIS without actually contextualizing what exactly happened in a specific context. So these are structural factors. And then there are agencies of Muslims, their leadership, to what extent they are well organized, and to what extent their discourse is inclusive and powerful. So all these combination in each specific case actually can explain the success or the failure of democracy. But generally speaking, I say that I think overwhelming majority of people in the Muslim world, and I would say everywhere, it's a common sense. You actually want to rule yourself or your destiny. They very much appreciate these values. And by the way, these values are not particularly Western, and they are not particularly or uniquely secular. Much of this so-called secular legacy we have comes from religious tradition, reinvention and reinterpretation of tradition. So we have actually go beyond this sort of dichotomies and essentializing this concept. Sorry for being tough.
No, thank you very much. To be honest, exactly this is what I wanted to hear. Oh, lovely, brilliant. I'm gonna invest in that kind of response, Ramazan, if that's okay. I'm gonna ask you about whether Muslim exceptionalism is a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy or not. Whether we in the West somehow reinforcing the idea of Muslim exceptionalism somehow, and if there is any problem in terms of democratization in Muslim majority context, how much of the problem is coming from within society versus external forces, kind of imposed by external forces? I would love to hear your reflection on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So I think it can indeed be self-fulfilling prophecy, the Muslim exceptionalism. As Mujtaba was talking in his speech, the roots of Muslim exceptionalism is actually in Orientalist scholarship. It started from the Orientalist scholarship in the West because the lack of transition to more secular modernity in the Muslim world required an explanation, and it came from the West, and some people started to think there should be something essential with these societies, essential with this culture that really prevents democracy to emerge in those lands. So, however, also there were critics of this, of course, in the West and in the Muslim world, who simply argued that this is just reinforcing stereotypes, and it doesn't reflect the diversity of people, diversity of viewpoints, and diversity of cultural diversity within the Muslim world. However, there have been lots of proponents of this idea within the Muslim world as well, mainly Islamists, right? Islamists also think that there is an exceptionalism. The state and religion is merged, and it is hard to come up something that we have in the West. So, and Islamists are not alone. Even, for example, I am from Turkey originally, and in Turkey, even before the Islamists, when our secularist governments were being criticized about some of the human rights violations, they were saying, we are not Europe, we are different. We don't live in Switzerland. We live in Turkey, and there are different conditions. So even authoritarian leaders embrace the idea because it serves to their own interests. It serves to the narrative. It serves to maintain the status quo. So, of course, another thing is Western geopolitical calculations. I mean, it also somehow reinforces the idea. Think of Saudi Arabia. I think it is very convenient for the United States, where I am also from. I am a Turkish American. So in the United States, it's very convenient to ignore some of the human rights violations in Saudi Arabia to continue geopolitical relationship with the state, right? And that there are definitely some self-fulfilling prophecy there. And it is self-fulfilling prophecy not only from a psychological process, but self-interest, because this also serves to the interest of some of the actors who love to continue, who love to maintain the notion of Muslim exceptionalism. In terms of outcomes, of course, this self-fulfilling prophecy discourages democratic movements. Sometimes even those who are very liberal, who believe in the value of democracy and human rights, may be influenced from this dominant view, and they can say, oh, nothing can happen in my own country because of this and that kind of discouragement. Also externally, it is actually foreign policy. Western powers may actually be less attentive to what public really think, be less attentive to political participation if they are having a good relationship with authoritarian leaders in those countries. On the second part of your question, is it external or internal? I think both. I mean, the Muslim, in my answer to self-fulfilling prophecy, I tried to explain why it serves to authoritarian leaders to believe in that, right? So that also, in terms of ISIS, I agree that ISIS couldn't have emerged if that geopolitical context did not occur, but at the same time, there are some doctrinal things that can be used. I mean, the Muslims also lacked a more reformist and more liberal type of philosophy. Without that kind of a philosophy, I mean, it will be hard to make that transition. To me, that's one of the reasons why Turkey's Erdogan, in Turkey, yes, I agree that it was probably a post-Islamist movement in the early 2000s. But later, because it didn't have a very liberal ideology in itself, it was very pragmatic, and pragmatism can lead to liberalism, but it can also lead to authoritarianism when it serves your interest. That's what we have seen. So Muslims are, I think, to create political theology of a democratic common life, if you is in the line of the theme. So that's I think the responsibility that is burdened on the Muslims, and I'm glad that Mustafa mentioned some of the intellectual fronts in that, but they are not actually mass movements. So that I think is something that we need internally. Of course, another thing is from an internal perspective, most of the Islamist movements are actually legacies of secular authoritarian era. They were socialized into politics from that angle. So instead of, when they come to power, instead of changing the rules of the game, they kept the rules of the game but changed the winners and losers. So that's also somehow internal. So instead of secular nationalist authoritarianism, we ended up being in Turkey. I'm speaking from the Turkish experience, most Muslim authoritarian or Muslim nationalism even kind of thing. So I think some of it is internal. But of course, externally, again, as I mentioned, global geopolitical dynamics led Western countries to work with authoritarian regimes. And I think Muslim exceptionalism, the notion of Muslim exceptionalism, gave them some comfort in doing so. they didn't think that these people deserve the kind of freedoms that we enjoy here. So that geopolitical external things is also has been also valid, I think.
Great. Thank you very much. And Sophia, we talked about Muslim exceptionalism. I think we need to talk about Christian nationalism. And I wonder, do you see any sort of differences or similarities between Christian nationalism and sort of political Islam as we just covered today? I would love your reflection on
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. Well, as both of my colleagues have expressed, political Islam takes many different forms and shapes, and even Islamic exceptionalism can take many forms and shapes. And as been pointed out, is largely a sort of Orientalist creation that is either embraced or rejected. So in talking about similarities and differences, I think I specifically want to talk about Christian nationalism and Islamic exceptionalism as embraced by Islamicists, to kind of keep it specific. But a couple of similarities. Both of them have the claim to a unique nature of their religion for politics, for their political settings over against other religions and ideologies. There's this emphasis of a sharp break in tradition. So for Christian nationalism, the sharp break from like the earlier Jewish traditions and with Islam with a break from Jewish and Christian traditions before them, as well as other indigenous traditions. But this is all part of a vision of a sort of previous golden age, and a sort of calling for a return to or reconstruction of a type of power and agency. I think Professor Madhavi talked about it as a sort of reinterpretation in some ways. And I think it's important when we're talking about these sort of narratives and myths, the uses of symbols, etc., that in many cases it's not so important to them whether it reflects historical reality. So in thinking about the claim to these sharp breaks in tradition that make them so different, like we know with critical scholarship that many early Christians still consider themselves Jewish for a long time after the Jesus movement. And similarly, there's been recent challenges to thinking about early followers of Muhammad and whether they still embraced their indigenous heritage and as well as Jewish and Christian identities and didn't see those in conflict to each other. So historically, we know that the story is much more complex. But for Christian nationalism and Islamic exceptionalism, as embraced by Islamicists, it's not particularly important because it's more the creation of a sacred political myth, both in the past, but also as a way for casting this ideal future vision. And I think one of the most pointed similarities that we see is in the most conservative circles on both sides. The vision is often centered on scriptural determinism. So leading to a specific form of fundamentalism, the emphasis on pure faith in these sorts of claims, which is often based on literal interpretation of the Word of God, whether that's mediated through an authoritative translation or the claim to or the opposite, which is a claim to only the original language being authoritative in these sorts of things. But both of them are arising, I think, as Professor Madhavi addressed, largely from the deficiencies, the felt deficiencies in religious communities of secularism. Both of them are largely feeding into or appealing to communities who have felt that they are not represented in their political aspirations, in their pragmatic needs, in their society supports by secularism and utilitarianism and these other forms of government that have come before. So I think they're both, in a sense, trying to answer similar questions, or at least similar felt challenges and wrongs. The most drastic difference, as we've spoken about a lot, is in the construction of the conversation, particularly the global conversation, because Christian nationalism, I would argue, comes from the intellectual tradition of Christendom itself, in the sense that it has this claim to unique authority, to a unique vision, and these sorts of things. But because it has the benefit of a Western heritage, it has been made palatable to a Western audience, or even, I would say, to even non-Christian audiences that are seeking a palatable form of non-secular political engagement, so to speak. On the opposite side of that, the vision of Islamicist engagement and Islamic exceptionalism, as constructed from these Orientalist stereotypes from the West, has been presented as extreme in every way, in much of the dominant conversation. So we talked about, of course, like gender issues, women's issues, how do we implement and enforce Sharia law, and all of these things which are seen as scary and other, because that's the way that the conversation has been constructed. I think it's helpful to think about Christian nationalism as having constructed the discourse of Islamicism and Islamic exceptionalism as a sort of dark mirror to itself. So the claim is we must fear Islamicists because they claim superiority and they want to wipe out everyone else. When that is in some ways not so different than Christian nationalists' own message. But as we said, it's been made more palatable, it's been made more subtle. Christianism has been translated into culturalism, Europeanism, etc. So I think, this conversation and the way that it's framed is the biggest opposition between them.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Before we open the floor for discussion for the audience, a quick question again from all three panelists. As pointed out by many scholars, we live in a kind of troubling times, particularly for democracy. So what do you see possibly as the most promising way forward towards a more pluralistic, just society? Are there any lessons from post-Islamism, from Christian democratic thought possibly that we should consider here? Just quickly, please. Start from Professor Mahdavi, please. Can you start?
What is the future prospects?
Yeah, it's a kind of normative question. What would you perhaps suggest here for us towards a more pluralistic society? What should we do?
Well, we have good ideas, but usually politicians don't listen to us. So forget about that. But when it comes to major challenges these days, are many, of course, but probably one common challenge we can actually see across the globe is the rise of extremist form of nationalism, right-wing populism, which has many faces of democratic backsliding, politics of identity in a very negative sense of the term, too much nativism, bridging the wall, Puritanism in a form of religious or secular form. And I think, in my humble view, one of the main problems, factors which actually contributed to the rise of this right-wing populism, excessive form of nationalism, is the crisis of new liberal global order, globally, regionally, locally. because it seems to me many of these systems, institutions do not work properly. They do not represent the voice of ordinary people. The gap between poor and rich is widening. The rise of a new class, which is something we can call it middle class poor, is rising. Middle class poor might sound strange because you are either middle class or poor, but now there is a combination of both. A growing number of people culturally, socially belong to the middle class, but financially, economically are poor. So this actually creates a condition for the rise of great men to actually come and save the world or make the country great again. That's probably one major challenge. And the rest of, this is where you can actually see the weaponization, instrumentalization of religion, ethnicity, race, even secular discourse is actually something actually to empower the right-wing populists. So we probably need to work on certain structural factors and not simply ideas. Because ideas, as we know, Max Weber says, idea actually needs social setting in order to get empowered. Abstract ideas are powerless. And this is where probably I would start. But I know easier than said than done, I guess.
I think one of the things that you have touched on both in your responses and in your lecture that we see in several of the conflicts going on now is this, the trouble of the singularity, or this claim that there is only the one that can be the true way forward. So in Ukraine and Russia, we have the Russian world ideology and the idea that it's the Russian Orthodox Church that is to be in charge of that area, with Israel and Palestine, the singularity of Israel as an ethnic state, and therefore any criticism of Israel is criticism not of the state itself only, but of Jewishness and Judaism as a whole, which has led to the complications of Western support for Palestine. And I think both traditions would really benefit from embracing their diverse traditions and heritages. I think so I'm trained as a biblical scholar, and one of the first things we learn when looking at any of the sacred texts is that there's not just one voice but a multiplicity of voices, and that plays out in the history of religious contexts, religious traditions, globally and locally, I think. And so I really appreciate the Islamic concept. You'll have to forgive me if I misunderstand this, but takfir. But the idea that there are some people who are just looking for reasons to say you are not Muslim or you are not Christian, to be able to have that sense of being in the in-group. But actually, my understanding is that people who go around and do this too much are reprimanded for being takfiri. And I think Christians in particular, for all of our love of doctrine, have a lot to learn from being able to embrace different iterations of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a religious person, as you said. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I can add on these comments, so I can build those, build on the comments that Mushtaba and Sofia made. So, yes, we are in crisis of maybe liberalism or market capitalism, whatever you call, and we see the rise of far-right politics in Western countries, in the United States, in Europe, and in Germany that we have observed recently. And Global Perception Index in 2024 showed that there is a global, there is a decrease in trust in democratic institutions in the West, especially in the light of the recent events. So people started to, even in the Muslim world, but in the West as well, not only minorities, Western people started to ask questions about, is the West sincere in their embrace of human rights? Is freedom of speech even protected even in the United States, where it is like one of the most sacred things for the US Constitution, First Amendment rights. So all these events actually revealed the limits of freedom in the West. But my positive side is, but it also provides an opportunity for Muslims to refute Muslim exceptionalism. Because we have seen that democracy is not necessarily the property of the West, and authoritarianism is not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily belong to non-West. It doesn't necessarily belong to the Muslim countries. We are seeing the tide of authoritarianism here. I mean, not here, not Oxford, but in the United States, in many European countries, we have seen the limits of freedom of speech in those places. So maybe a different narrative is now possible more than ever, because then the universality of these values, both authoritarianism and democracy, is more clear than ever at this point. Maybe this can challenge the Muslim exceptionalism notion among the Muslims, and it can maybe increase a new movement, a more mass movement can be possible that can embrace pluralism and democracy.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So resistance, this is what we need to do. Now let's open the floor for discussion. You have this, okay. So you've got a mic. Please, if you have any questions, just raise your hand so I can see your hand. And of course, that's the mic here. If you can, yeah, I see one hand over there, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your lovely discussion. My question is to Professor Madhvi. When we are talking about Islamism and post-Islamism, how do we place the narrative, especially in the Indian context? And when I talk about the Indian context, I want to be more specific and taking something that you were talking about, which is the sacred versus the secular. You know, the emerging emphasis of the nation defining itself as a secular nation, keeping the institutions intact in terms of democracy, universal adult franchise, but a narrative that is hegemonically emerging, which is the Hindu national narrative, which is defining the minority or Muslim population as the other, the enemy, the outsider, the infiltrator. And the crisis that this sacred versus secular creates in terms of identity politics within that context. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not expert in Indian politics. I lived in India for some time. But what I can say, yeah, I agree with what you say. Unfortunately, India over the past few years is not doing what's supposed to be doing. I mean, I know economically they are doing somehow well under neoliberal policies, but when it comes to the rise of Hindu nationalism, extremist form of Hindu fundamentalism, creating the Muslims as the other, and actually challenging the principles of secularism in India, which actually means pluralism. I mean, secularism means pluralism, right? Basically, I mean, it's not about being anti-religious. It basically means being neutral with respect to everyone, respecting everyone's religious and non-religious identity. So here, in the context of India, of course, with the rise of extremist form of Hindu nationalism, I will not be surprised to see the rise of Islamism. But I hope that's not the case, and there are, of course, I guess Muslims who appreciate that the solution is not another form of exclusionary politics. It's the solution to this extremist form of politics is more inclusion and more, I guess, sort of post-Islamist, post-secular politics, if you wish. I hope that's the case. We know that some Muslims in India and Pakistan have been influenced by Maulana Maududi's Islamist discourse, some even Jamaat-e-Islami and others. But perhaps a better example for Muslims in the subcontinent would be Allama Iqbal Lahori, a very, I guess, well-known and quite informed Muslim philosophers who actually knew Islamic tradition and Western philosophy at the same time. Mysticism, definitely, and quite comprehensive. I hope actually people over there, or Fazlur Rahman would be another actually better example for Muslims actually to look into in the subcontinent.
Thank you so much for this talk and the roundtable. It's lovely to hear all of your discussion of this wonderful talk. So I just want to echo Sophia's lauding the plurality that you've drawn out of multiple, this conference is the political theologies as well, right? So it is important to be thinking about all sorts of different representations of the religious traditions you are speaking to. But one of the questions that occurred to me as you were talking about that is, it does sound to me like there's, maybe the better way to put it is, I'm forwarding to you a question that Clementine asked me earlier today, that like, are there some bounds of what might be an appropriate representation of Muslim theology or Muslim political theology? Presumably there are some political theologies that would not be appropriately imagined to be Muslim or Christian or any number of things. And some of those political theologies might be more or less compatible with democracy. A different way of putting the question is, one of the things that's lingering with me is it sounds like some of the political theology that you're presenting, Professor, is really concordant with what I would imagine as a rightly attributed Christian political theology. And I imagine that there are a number of religious practitioners, Muslim and Christian, who would say, wow, y'all seem quite similar, quite resemblant. Why is there so much more contact between these two versions than within our respective religious traditions? Is there some kind of syncretism or something like that going on here? So how would you address a question like that? Do you still want to identify some bounds of the religious tradition? Or how might you kind of constrain the tradition that you're working within?
Thank you very much for a very important question that I am going to complicate even further by saying I think one of the biggest challenges for embracing religious political diversity is that oftentimes we want to embrace, I think especially for those of us who are engaged in an interfaith dialogue, a specific type of generally liberal or progressive political expression of religious tradition, and that if we're serious about embracing diversity, we have to address the needs and desires felt by religious communities across the political spectrum. So that includes conservative communities. I don't have a good answer for that, but just to say it, I think this is really important that we're addressing it. So I don't know if you want to speak, either of you, to her question about Muslim political theology.
I think when we are talking about it, we need to pay attention to politics. I'm a political scientist by training. And when I look at, more conservative or just Islamists as Islamists, I see their approach toward more, not because of religion, but because of the political experience, more reactive. Because as I mentioned when I was giving my remarks, Islamism emerged against Western colonialism and secular nationalism, right? So I think we need time to go beyond that, because maybe we just get rid of Islamism and maybe in post-Islamism that will happen. But I think one of the problems has been being reactive. And that being reactive is not only because of that context, but also it sometimes serves to the interests of those who are in power, because again, I will give another example from Turkey. Whenever the Turkish government led by Erdogan, for example, whenever he had domestic challenges to his government, he brings up anti-Westernism, he brings up anti-secularism. And that has something to do with it, because in the end, Islamists or the Muslim conservative parties mobilized their supporters through these two things, because that was what those movements were built on. And I think that's why, unless they go beyond that reactionism, it is hard to develop a political theology that is more of supportive of Islamism. But even the most conservative versions of Islam can do that once we go beyond those binaries that we inherited, I guess.
I guess you said what is needed to say, but generally speaking, I think the root causes of many of so-called religious wars are political. It's a weaponization of, I guess, religion, religious discourse, theology. In the context of Middle East and Muslim world, we usually hear the idea of sectarianism. Shiites against Sunni, or actually, or Muslims against Jews, Muslim against Christians, or a typical idea of clash of civilizations. The concept coined by Bernard Lewis and was developed by Professor Samuel Huntington. And by the way, Samuel Huntington's book represents an excellent work of bad scholarship. Definitely, and the more he actually added to it, it got worse. Because it basically represents the core idea of exceptionalism and representing religion, culture, things as the fundamental problem or essence of conflict. Most of these, I guess, problems are very much instrumentalization, weaponization of religion, ethnicity, sex. We don't have really sectarianism, we have sectarianization. We don't really have religious war. It's basically political conflict over resources with certain elements of religious discourse, which actually can fuel this. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Yeah.
Well, thank you for this wonderful lecture and discussion. I have a question for all the panelists. Well, do you think the recent case of the Columbia University has any broader implications for the Islamic scholarship at Western universities? Will this case will be available in the near future in Europe, and what conditions?
Yeah, talk about race applicability. I think the number one takeaway that we can have from Columbia University is really actually not super religious, but is about universities as bastions of free speech. Even as I say that, I know it's controversial to talk about what free speech is, and we've spoken about how even in the US, where it's enshrined as a value, we're seeing it decrease less and less. But I also think that it's a good example of the weaponization of protecting religious minorities when it's clear that political administration doesn't actually have their interests at heart. But I think maybe the two of you can say more about the prospects of Islamic studies in the future.
Yeah, I don't know much about the prospect of Islamic studies, but I think it's not a good sign for the prospect of, academic freedom in the future, prospect of freedoms in general, but also it is also a sign, the point that I was trying to make about the trend in the West can be a good opportunity for the Muslim majority countries to refute Islamic exceptionalism. This is also another way of saying that I think this can also be a good example. A university like Columbia University giving in to pressures, state pressures, tells a lot. In Turkey, for example, we have had I'm sorry for giving lots of examples from Turkey today. So we have had lots of pressure against the universities, and one particular university, Boğaziçi University, professors there have been still protesting for several years, I think in the past 6 years. And recently when the government actually arrested Erdogan's rival in the next elections, there have been lots of protests across the country as well. I mean, these are some signs of like liberties, freedoms. I mean, they are universal, and and in Turkey, going out to the streets and protesting is a big risk, given the government is detaining, arresting. The chances of arrest is really, really high. So I think just comparing these two cases may give us some hope or despair. I don't know what to say, but at least we can say that both authoritarianism and freedoms are universal. Maybe that's one conclusion.
Yeah, just briefly, Italian scholars, as you know, says we need to overcome the pessimism of the intellect by optimism of the will. So there is a lot to be pessimistic about what's going on, the rise of right-wing populism, Trumpism with respect to violation of freedom of speech, weaponization of any discourse to suppress the other, and of course, shut down the whole humanities, social science, critical social studies, including Middle East and Islamic studies. So these are the pessimism side. The optimism is the younger generation and what they actually have shown, their courage for the future. So let's focus on the optimism of the will.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much, everybody, particularly to the panelists for their contribution and the audience for your engagement. And let's end the session. I hope today's discussion has offered you a sort of fresh and nuanced perspective on these vital debates. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.